Oops, let's try.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
All right. Going to give it a few minutes and we'll wait for a few more people to show up here and then we'll do some introductions.
You know, that handbook that you sent around a week or so ago, I think is really very helpful.
Yeah, that was the one that from Angie's group there. That was I thought it was great.
And it has a section on this Vermont CUDs too, which
Yes. Hi Ellie, how are you doing?
I'm well. How are you folks?
Good, good. We're gonna give it another minute or two. Some people might be joining us a little bit late. We'll just give a couple more minutes for people to jump on and then we'll get started.
Great.
has there been any discussion of creating something like this in Massachusetts?
Well, this might be the start of that, David. We're trying to see what the benefit's going to be, and Mark Lanigan, who's on the line from Senator Markey's office, has there he is right now. He's offered to try to help us along these lines if possible, and if there's enough interest. So we're gonna we'll start the conversation and then see where it takes us.
I just think it looks like a terrific way to proceed. Be very helpful to us.
Right. Right. And okay, so it's we'll give it one more minute. We'll start at 2:33. Okay. Okay, good. So it is well, I've got 2:32 here, but we'll get this meeting started. It's March 21st. First or second day of spring, is it here? I think it's the second day, right? And we we have a special guest with us tonight for our Mass Broadband Coalition meeting. Ellie DeVilliers, did I pronounce that correct, Ellie?
You did.
Okay. And she's going to talk to us about the Connecticut Union District model and that we've heard a little bit about.
Vermont, not
Vermont.
Connecticut.
Oh, I'm sorry. I said Vermont. Yes, absolutely. Completely different state. I would like to go through for her benefit, and have everyone introduce themselves, and then we'll ask her to, tell us a little about who she is and her company and everything, organization. So I'm Bob Espandola, from the town of Fairhaven, and select board member there until April 1st. And then I'll be finishing my 12th year, and I will be no longer a select board member, which is something that I do want to talk to the group about. Probably send an email about, because I will no longer have this email address that you guys are used to seeing emails from me on. And we need to really talk about if someone else kind of wants to take the lead with this group to help keep things moving, or if you want me to still coordinate things, I can do that, but it would just be through a private email. So I'd want you to recognize something new coming to you. But and then we'll just go in order of how I'm seeing people on the screen. Robert Dwyer, why don't you go ahead next?
Hi, my name is Bob Dwyer. I'm the chair of the Cable, Internet, and Telecom Advisory Committee to the Bourne Select Board.
All right, great. And David Cole, we'll go with you next.
Yeah, David Cole, Westport, member of the Internet Advisory Committee in Westport.
Okay, and then Carl Allen.
Carl Allen, I'm a planner with the city of Chelsea.
Okay, and Mike Wells.
I am the IT director for the Town Schools of Westford and also a member of the Communications Advisory Committee there.
Oh, great. I think this might be the first time we've had you in one of our meetings. Is it?
I did come to some early on. I haven't been to very many of them, I confess, but
Okay, no problem.
not a complete newcomer.
No, it wavers from meeting to meeting. It's a lot of times it's a different group of people, but that's no problem at all. Okay, now, okay, Rich, Pierce.
Yes, I'm Rick Pierce. I'm from Somerset, and I'm one of the Somerset Selectmen's representatives to the Southeastern Massachusetts Regional Planning District.
Okay, and Brian Espinola.
I am Brian Espinola, sitting in New Bedford, senior programmer analyst.
Great, thank you. Bob Egan. Not sure if
Muted.
you might be muted, Bob Egan.
Hi, Bob Egan. I sit as a technical advisor to the town of Falmouth, the Falmouth Net broadband industry.
All right, great. And Greg Kay.
Hey guys, all right, I'm sorry, I'm driving across the street. So I don't know if I sort of snuck in the back door, but a colleague of mine, Paul Looney, shared this committee opportunity, I guess, with me earlier today. And I'm in the business development office with Luck Grove Telecom, based out of Syracuse and all over upstate New York. But I'm also on the leadership council for the New York State Telecom Association. And we've had some projects and been part of some things in Vermont, but I'm very new to the industry, like less than 12 months. So any opportunity to sort of learn and try to really get my arms better wrapped around this thing that's constantly evolving and growing, I sort of just try and soak it all in. So I hope I'm not overstepping or like I said, sneaking in the back door, but that's who I am. And yeah.
Okay, and Paul, is Paul from Graybar? Is that who I'm thinking of?
He's no, not Graybar. Gosh, what's his?
I recognize
I don't
the
want
name.
to misspeak. Yeah, he's been a supplier of fiber. I mean,
Okay.
all over, not only just the Northeast, but several different countries. And but yeah,
Okay.
he's definitely plugged into the Massachusetts pipelines because that's where he's based out of.
Okay, and what's your last name, Greg?
Kansadian. It's a mouthful. Greg K was safe. I've heard some different iterations of it over my life, but yeah, Greg Kanzadian.
Oh, okay. All right. And I've got, let's see, next is Ken Bell. Did yeah, Ken. Might be muted, Ken. We'll come back to you, Ken. Mark Lanigan.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, my name is Mark Flanagan. I am regional assistant in Senator Ed Markey's office in his Boston office, specifically I'm the point person in state on telecommunications and emerging technology. So Senator is very supportive of all the work that you all are doing. Super excited to be here. Thanks, Bob.
All right, you're welcome. And Peter Chase.
Hey, yep, Peter Chase from Dartmouth, Mass. Just the community television director here, and also on the Broadband Advisory Board as a staff member.
All right, great. And Tom Worthington.
Hi, Tom Worthington. I'm with Taunton Municipal Lighting Plant down here in Taunton, public municipality, and we have a small ISP that we're trying to grow.
All right, great. I think the only person I missed was Ken Bell. I think if you're on with us and you can unmute, Ken.
So I can speak for Ken. Ken works also here with me at Taunton Municipal Lighting Plant. He probably is on a call with a customer
Okay.
right now.
Sure.
So he might have stepped away.
All right, so you have good customer service then.
We try.
All right, now Ellie, you can go ahead and introduce yourself and take it away, and we'll let you just kind of do whatever presentation you'd like to do. We can you can share your screen. You can just, and then we'll just we'll do your introduction first, and then we'll talk about if you want to allow people to ask questions. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed someone. Karen Alcott.
Hi there. I'm from the town of Falmouth and a telco advisor.
Okay, great. Thank you. So go ahead now, Ellie. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. So it's great to meet everyone. So my name is Ellie de Villiers, as you heard, and I run one of the communications union districts here in Vermont in Addison County. So I'm the executive director, which means I'm happen to be the sole staff member. I'm also a member of the governing board, and I'm also, for my sins, as they say, I'm the elected president and chair of the Vermont CUD Association. So my background, long time ago, I used to work in software, and actually I'm a former resident of Massachusetts. I was there from I think it was about 2000 to 2010, and then I moved to South Africa, where I was from 2010 to 2020, and then I came back to Vermont. So I lived a bunch of places. I lived in Everett, I lived in Arlington, I lived in Natick, and I lived in Bolton. So I lived all over the show. So it's nice to see some folks from some similar places and some new places. And I was wondering, actually, just before I get going, could you give me a little bit more context to what all you folks are trying to achieve here, just to make sure that I tailor, because I'll give you the history, and I have a couple slides we've shown to the legislature, which might help orient the history and what we're doing and some of the Vermont context, but it would probably just help me focus on the things you care about and not focus on the things you don't care about as much, if I have a sense of what you're trying to achieve with this group.
Yeah, so it's probably, anybody else can jump in and add to what I'm going to say right here, but we came together just as, understanding that we all, many of us happen to be working with one particular consultant at the time, who we had been hearing had been working with other communities. So we just decided it might be good for us to kind of get together, talk among each other what we're trying to do, and share notes and that kind of thing. And others have joined the group over time that might not have been working with that same consultant. But we have really, everyone's has ambitions here of trying to build infrastructure in their community. Some have a strong interest in also looking at DEI components with their build out of that infrastructure in time. Everyone's struggling with ways to find funding, and but we're learning about all the opposition that takes place when communities come forward. Some of these the dark money that's out there kind of fighting people, and we share information about grant funding and opportunities like that. There are some communities in our local South Coast Massachusetts area that are considering like a regional approach to building, because we've heard, through developers that economies of scale are good to an extent, the smaller communities may not be, get the best price point, that kind of thing. So,
And
it's, yeah, go
I
ahead,
just
Dave.
add something. I think that what I've seen out of Vermont is that they have really taken the leadership in helping to support the local communities in developing their broadband. And I'm particularly interested in any ideas you can give us as to how to get state leadership. Our state leadership, to my mind, is focused on issues that don't really have broad impact and don't really facilitate getting moving on this. So I think the role of the state working through your CUDs and the legislation is very important.
I think David's comments, you're probably referring specifically to broadband.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
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 Okay. Anybody else want to add anything else about what you feel, our group's been together for? Okay. So it's kind of, I guess that gives you, some idea, but, and we try to have a guest speaker in, every month or every other month or so to try and learn, for example, we had someone came in one time and talked about a make-ready legislation they're trying to put in Massachusetts to try and expedite that process. And we had, as you probably know from the introduction that was made to you through Gigi Son, that she had, she came to our February meeting and talked to us. So that kind of thing, just, we find that very helpful to have people come in and kind of share with us, what's going on in the industry.
Yeah, make ready is an interesting one. Vermont has a pretty good regulation on that. I think Maine is another good one to look at as well. Okay, so thank you for that context. So I think I do have some slides, but I think maybe just before I start presenting slides, I'll explain a little bit about what a communications union district is, which is actually this first slide here. But maybe, sorry, actually prior to that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history, because I realize I don't actually have a slide on that. I pulled up slides we presented to the legislature at various times because they're nice overview slides that have some basic talking points. And I was actually trying to find the link, but I will find it and send out to you guys and put it in the chat. But there's actually a documentary that our broadband office, the Vermont Community Broadband Board, released very recently. I think the premiere was about a week ago or something like that.
Wow.
And it's about 35 minutes long. You can stream it for free online, and it talks about it goes into depth about the history of communications union districts and the problem we're trying to solve. So it might be a nice supplement to this with some popcorn or something later this week or this weekend. And it goes into great depth on the story of EC Fiber, because that's really why we're all here. So there's a long history to it, even longer than what they got into in the documentary. But basically, people in East Central Vermont, around the Dartmouth Valley area, they came to the realization that there were broadband deserts, and there were rural areas that were just never going to get any sort of broadband in anyone's lifetime unless people came together and changed the paradigm. That's the realization they came to. And they went out and they apparently had, I think it was a $10 million municipal bond that was about to be placed. And then literally the next day, the financial crisis hit. Municipal bond market went away. They had to start over. And they actually went around selling $10,000 promissory notes to people to raise enough money to start to get a little bit of traction. So, I mean, they had to really just claw from nothing to do the fundraising to be able to build. And as you mentioned earlier, Bob, it's not particularly efficient or cost efficient to be starting with very limited capital and building a mile or two or three, and trying to build a revenue base. But they did eventually, over years, managed to get together a big enough network that they got the attention of folks, and this comes to your politics question, they got the attention of folks in the State House who said, wow, this is actually a really interesting model. And the story that I like to tell, and actually it's now, but speaking of the documentary, I was reminded of this yesterday because there's a guy who works for Mozilla Foundation now, but his name is Steve Song. And some of you guys may know him, but he's quite famous in Africa as being, he's a Canadian guy, he's quite famous as being someone who just knows what's going on with worldwide best practice. And when I first heard of EC Fiber was actually when I was in Africa. I heard about it from Steve Song, and then he shared the documentary yesterday and said, "Oh, Ellie, I didn't realize you were doing this in Maple Broadband, and look at this great story of what's going on here in Vermont." So it's kind of a cool story about how it's came a little bit full circle for me personally. But to make a long story short, EC Fiber was the trailblazers, and the folks in Montpelier said, "This is interesting," and they had EC Fiber up there to testify to say, "Okay, well, what did you do, and how could we get more of it?" Because there's lots of rural areas in the state that, again, they're not going to get broadband for a very long time because it's just. I think people are of different opinions on this. Whether there is a business case and private companies are simply not interested, and I mean, I've worked for private sector plenty in my life. It could be that sometimes there's literally no business case to negative ROI, or it could be that there is a business case, but it's not a sufficiently interesting business case when you have denser areas, maybe in other states that have more people per mile and are more profitable. And with limited capital and opportunity costs, you're always going to build the areas that have the bigger return first. So it may be that some areas would never get it, and some areas were just they'd get it in 10 or 20 years when someone got around to it. But the folks in Montpelier looked at that and they asked EC Fiber, "Well, what do we need to do?" And EC Fiber, at least as they tell the story now, they said, "Well, get first of all, you need to encourage these CUDs to get off the ground." So the first thing was actually to create a law to create communications union districts. And how that happened was that EC Fiber, that was part of EC Fiber's trying to get to the bond market, that when they originally started, they were an interlocal organization, which was towns got together and they formed a pact essentially to work together. It's a bit more technical than that, but that's essentially what it was. And they were trying to place a municipal bond, and the bond placement people said, "Well, like, what are you? We don't understand what sort of entity you are. Why aren't you like a water district or a sewer district?" And they said, "Oh, that's a good point. Basically, what we want to be is a broadband utility district." So they went to the legislature and said, here's what we've done. Because this is when they'd first sold promissory notes. They had some network, and they were then trying to get money to get to the next level. So the legislature created a law to facilitate them going to the bond market. So that created a legal structure for communications union districts. But again, you have to without money, you have to get to that point of having a sort of a minimum critical mass. So there's a little bit of seed money that the legislature put up in 2019. And then in 2020, the pandemic hit. And with the pandemic, all of a sudden, everyone nationwide realized, oh dear, it's actually a real problem when you have people who don't have broadband at home. And oh dear, this is actually quite pervasive. There's large areas of our states where people just don't have any sort of sufficient broadband to do anything. You try and download, and I mean, you guys know the challenges. I don't need to belabor that point. And so the state of Vermont, part of its ARPA allocation was dedicated specifically to broadband. And as part of that, the state decided strategically that basically because of what the politicians deemed a market failure in the rural areas. So there was a lack of competition, and B, the private companies, like I mentioned earlier, just had failed to demonstrate any sort of an interest, and in some cases had actively basically said, sorry, it's just not going to happen. They said, look, well, we don't really want to give money to these guys who've said that they're not interested and have said it's never going to happen. So let's have this money go to these new entities we've created, these communications union districts. But the law was set up in such a way where it's specifically encouraged public-private partnerships, because those of you folks who've either worked for ISPs or work with ISPs or know anything about it, you understand that there's really two different parts, right? There's building the physical infrastructure, and then there's running the business, or running the call center, provisioning the products, running the billing systems, getting the bandwidth, configuring the routers, making sure that everything works technically. And to try and do all of that as a startup, low scale, no scale, that's really a lot. The step function to go from not doing anything to having enough staff to be able to do things well was quite a big cost. And so the legislation encouraged, it didn't mandate, but it certainly encouraged communications union districts to form public-private partnerships. And there's actually a number of different models that CDs have come up with to solve this problem. But essentially, they look like the communications union districts design and build the infrastructure, usually design, but always build and own. And then the private sector partners do the ISP back office sort of bit. So in the industry lingo, you sometimes hear of an infraco, which is a company that owns the infrastructure, and then a servco, company that provides the service. So CDs are essentially public entities that are infracos. So our job is to build infrastructure as efficiently and cost effectively as possible, and also in line with the legislative mandates and our own strategic mandates. And then we partner with private sector to operate the network. So that's some overview, and then I have some slides that go into a bit more detail on some of the details, and some of the nuances of this. But before I do, does anyone have any questions at this point, or anything I've said that particularly sparks you that you want me to go into more detail?
Well, so the one thing that interested me, the bond. So by having this law in place that allows the formation of the CUDs, that one of the biggest benefits is that you can borrow as an entity like that, as a a partnership, a group, and are your rates do they tend to be favorable like municipal rates, bond rates would be, because you're a government agency or entity, like you're backed by a government entity? Or
Okay, so that's a great point, and I should explain this. Now, the state of Vermont has a law on the books that prohibits public entities from having any sort of taxing authority. And this is there's a history to this, and the history is there was a public entity that had taxing authority and didn't make some good decisions and muddled things up and wound up getting sold for, I don't know if it was pennies on the dollar, but sold at a big discount to a private company. And so the bit of a knee-jerk reaction, but the reaction is, okay, let's just stop that. We're not going to allow it. So we actually don't. And this is I don't know how many other states might have similar laws, and different. This is one of the things that you folks probably heard from Gigi, is different states do things in different ways. So for example, out in Washington State, one of the public utility districts out there, at least, they get their funding by they actually put liens on properties, and it's a very different model. But here in Vermont, because we don't have any sort of taxing authority, so we can get our money from grants, we can get our money from loans, we can get our money from municipal bonds. And the specific kind of municipal bond, because we don't have any taxing authority, is actually a revenue bond. So essentially, we're pledging our future revenues to pay off our debts, and in order to do that, we have to have a strong enough business case, essentially, that enables that. And so, in terms of rates, I'm not a municipal bond expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I would have to think that revenue bonds are probably higher risk than bonds where you're taxing, because it's dependent on your revenue, especially when you're in an unregulated competitive market. There's no guarantees as to what your revenues are, and then also, of course, depending on how quickly you get to the revenue the ratio of how much debt you have to your revenue is really important. If you're trying to take on more debt than your revenue can cover, then you can't, right? So there's sort of that's the first thing, is you have to have sufficient revenues to be able to cover with enough margin the interest payments that you need, or the debt service payments. But also in general, the smaller of a business you are, or the earlier of a business you are, you're going to be paying a risk premium, the same as any other sort of. Financiers, they factor all these things into account in terms of the rate that you get. And so the rates, and also the prevailing interest rates does also come into play. So the rates that we've been hearing quoted in general for hitting the municipal bond market now for communications union districts are like 9-10%, which is not particularly attractive right now. So strangely enough, private capital, some of it is actually a little bit of better rates, but those things change. And when EC Fiber when they first went to the municipal bond market, I don't know, it's up on their website, but I want to say it was sort of like in the range of 5 to 7%. So a little bit better than 9, 10, maybe even 11%. I think you asked something else, but I got distracted. No.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to talk in general about what are the I suppose, advantages of being a private entity, because I think this is sorry, being a public entity, because this is part of the other innovation, if you will, which is it's kind of an obvious innovation when you think about it. But if you're a for-profit company, if you're a private company, then you have owners, you have shareholders, and they want to see some sort of a return, right? And that it'll be bigger or lesser depending on a whole bunch of different factors. But if you're a public entity, well, you don't actually have that. And so one of the things we like to say is we don't have shareholders, we have stakeholders. And so every dollar that comes in, we can put into either expanding the network, getting out to the last mile, or into digital equity programs, or into whatever all else. I mean, right now we're all busy building and not everyone has broadband, so that's the first thing. But over time, to your question about affordability and rates, over time, hopefully those will come down. But one of the other, I'm sort of getting ahead of myself here. But the way that most CUDs got our seed funding essentially through ARPA, and then so the ARPA money came into the state, and the state created the legislation, as I mentioned, which says that it wasn't exclusive to communications union districts, but it would basically said it can't conflict with the communications union district. So basically, the first right of refusal goes to communications union district as long as that CUD has a universal service plan, meaning that it must have a plan to get broadband to every on-grid address in this district, and B, it has to have a valid business plan. So we're not going to fund something which is going to fail. And so the implication of those two things is that there wasn't enough ARPA money to build everything at all. So we all had to come up with business plans that said, okay, well, we're going to make assumptions, not of course raising municipal bond or private debt right now, but we're going to make assumptions about interest rates and how much debt and whatnot. But in order to accept the grant money, we had to sign a grant agreement that said, yes, we will in fact cover all these other addresses with our own money in over whatever sort of time period. So that was I think a very good strategic move on behalf of the state. It's not like, you get the money and you build what you can with it, and then, well, if there isn't enough money, too bad. It's this is the condition of this grant money. If you accept this grant money, you will build to everyone, even if the grant money doesn't cover all of it, because it doesn't cover all of it. But actually, let me go back a second to some of the other advantages of being a public entity. So another one is that we're tax exempt. So that one helps, and particularly, for example, with the next round of federal funding coming, the BEAD program. If you're a private company, you're taxed on that, and Congress is trying to change that because it's actually kind of backwards. That you use taxpayer money to fund grants, and then you tax the recipients of those grants. But as it sits right now, CDs are tax exempt, and private companies are not. But also that applies to everything that we buy. Everything that we buy is tax exempt. So, I mean, okay, there are some small exceptions, like meals and rooms tax, for example, but for the most part, we're tax exempt, and that's a benefit. And then the other one is just because of our formation. So I've talked a little bit about a communications union district, and we are municipal utility districts, but how we actually formed is individual towns got together sort of organically to form the specific communications union districts that we have. And so we range in size from, I think the small CD is maybe like 18 towns, and the biggest one at the moment is 54. But every town had to have an affirmative vote. So the initial formation had to be at town meeting day, 2 towns to form the district. And then once the district was formed, other towns, select boards or city councils could essentially vote to join it. So CUDs formed, and then every town appoints a delegates to the governing board, and they can also appoint up to 2 alternates. And so the governing board, of course, has governance and oversight, but the structure, what this gives us is a very tight relationship with towns. And when it comes time for things, town-specific permits, like right-of-way permits, even things like communicating out to citizens in the town to say, hey, we're coming, and here's what we're doing, and here's our mission. It's very helpful because we have that, we are the towns are, I suppose you can think of towns as being a shareholder in a way, because the town joins, I mean, the district has its own assets, but the towns have governance over those assets. So once we complete our mission of getting broadband to every on-grid address, or other such obligations may fall under another grant that we get. Like BEAD has slightly different requirements, for example. If CDs are successful in the BEAD program, then the governing board can help set strategy and priority for example, let's take a simple example of where you have a district and some of the towns already have maybe one fiber provider and maybe Comcast is there or Charter's there. And then CDs succeed in building out to all the areas around the town. And so, okay, well, everyone now has broadband. So what do? Do you, for example, drop your rates? Or do you not drop your rates and bring fiber into that town in order to create more competition? Or do you do a combination of the two? Or how do you make that decision? So the governing board actually gets to decide. And I think that's another advantage. And that's when you look at the documentary, it talks a lot about grassroots effort and people coming together. And that was very true for EC Fiber and even for the rest of us that have been blessed with more than enough seed funding to get to critical mass. The fact that we have this tight relationship with the towns, I think, is quite a nice value.
All right. So let me just stop right there for a second and ask, and I asked the question, but I want to make sure everyone else has an opportunity. If you have anything right now for Ellie, you'd like to ask or comment on? Not right now. I'm wondering, Ellie, and if you are going to cover this in your slides, then maybe we can wait for that. But in terms of if you're dealing, let's just say, you mentioned 18 to 54 communities. I would imagine that there's a great range of different populations, densities in those communities, and the cost factors to build out between those communities is different. So how does how
Peppa Pig in the gym.
Hi everyone, here's my daughter Maya.
Hi Maya.
She's going to watch Peppa Pig in the gym, as you may have just heard.
Oh, all right.
Hi, Maya.
All right. So
sorry.
That's okay. That's the question is when you go to bonding and borrowing and then figuring out like how the cost of services are between different communities, is that kind of built out by community, or is it once you're in this, say it's 18 communities that you mentioned, they're all working under the same cost structure regardless of how the density is within the community?
Okay. So two different things. The cost structure doesn't vary too much. If anything, it's actually a little bit more expensive to build a mile in a city or a town than it is in a rural area. The reason being that in the towns you have more density, and so your cost of you're going to have more splice cases. So you're going to have more of a splicing cost to get that built and get that tested, and also the make ready. But for putting your fiber on the pole doesn't need to be replaced, and now all of a sudden you need to replace a pole, or even if it's just a matter of paying for the existing, like if you're maybe you're the top attacher and there's 6 other attachers that often move down a foot, you as the new attacher need to bear the cost of that. So your make ready costs are a lot higher in the towns, and so that's just talking about like an on-road mile. Where the rural areas can be more expensive is where the utility poles don't stick to the streets and they go through fields or they go over mountains or they do all sorts of weird things. That is where your cost can be significantly more expensive. In some areas, we've been very lucky in my part of the state because we don't have too much of that. We're in the Champlain Valley. It's quite flat, not terribly rocky for the most part, but some of my sister CDs are literally doing things like, pulling cable with horses, because hand pulling it is too onerous, for the poor crews. And so it's not quite as expensive. I mean, actually, I think there are a couple examples where people have literally buried the fiber because it's cheaper than that off-road, than pulling the cable off-road because the terrain is so rough. So that's something which can happen. I don't know how much of that you'd see. Again, it depends. I mean, that's really like a ultra rural sort of thing, and it depends a lot on the terrain. But to your other points, so that's on the cost side. But on the revenue side, of course, your cities and your towns are going to have far more. And actually, my slide literally talks about this: households per mile. And so that's where, once you have it built, that's where the revenue side comes in. Let me see if I can. Sorry, trying to make this thing bigger so I can actually see all of you while I'm presenting here. Okay, so this was talking about the different CUD laws, but this slide here, can you guys see this?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is an example. So Montpelier, that's our capital, has 380 households per mile. Barrie is the next town over here, 217.7. And the fact that these are green, this is showing that there's already, I think that's cable there, but there was already something, as opposed to out in the rural areas where there's absolutely nothing. So Groton has 10 households per mile. Peacham had 11.6. I picked these because they were close to where the legislature was. People would be familiar with the area. So my districts, some of our towns like Orwell, Shoreham, and Whiting, they were, when we started, they were literally 99 or in some cases 100% unserved, according to the definitions of Act 71, which followed the Treasury guidelines at the time and actually up until quite recently. So being unserved or underserved meant that you had less than 25.3. So there's DSL, or yeah, basically these households had DSL that was at 4.1 or less. That's crazy. And the reason for that is the primary reason I would say is density. There's there are other reasons. And so this is another illustration of what we were just talking about. That's essentially CUDs are public entities that are building strong businesses, because the broadband market it's a competitive market. And so we have to behave like any sort of, like public or private, it doesn't really matter. And I've made this point a lot, that you can have public companies, and I alluded to one earlier, you can have public entities that don't do things right and then waste money and are inefficient and just right, and that's a problem. And you can have private companies that do the same thing. And so it's really not a question to me of public or private, it's a question of good governance. And then, as I said, there are some advantages to being a public entity. There's some advantages as well to being a private entity, right? I mean, if you're a shareholder of that entity and you do a good job, that's a nice sort of incentive to be able to give staff sometimes, or management or whatnot. And then also the governance, or the governance and the transparency that comes with being a CUD is, I mean, I think it's fine for something like broadband, which is a utility, but certain other industries, you really need the nimbleness, and you don't want to be having the public disclosure and sometimes the long time frames to make decisions that come along with being a public entity. But yeah, so basically that's our goal, is to minimize costs, just like any sort of business. So transparent, competitive procurement. That is one advantage to being a public entity, is that you kind of have to make sure that you do procurement on the up and up, and not just giving awards to your buddy or your cousin or some guy you worked with in college. And building service revenues, that's so funding and financing, we talked about that. And this, so I would say this is kind of the fun part, actually, is trying to figure out, you have a puzzle of, I mentioned earlier the universal service commitment. So you have a district. My district is 20 towns, and within that, some areas are eligible for funding under ARPA, some are not. So as I said earlier, if an area is already served with cable or fiber, the grant funding doesn't cover it. But there are certain exceptions. So the way that our state wrote the rules is, if you have, because this is actually a really good example. This is the reason I put this here. That's if you're here in the middle of North Orwell Road, there's not very many houses, so those clearly you can use your grant funding to get to these unserved houses. But if you guys, if you're driving in rural parts of your town or your state, you'll notice that the houses along the main road, they probably already have something, whether it's cable or fiber. It's the side roads that don't have anything. But in order to get to the side roads, you have to go down the main roads. And so if you have a rule that says something like, well, only 20% of your addresses can be served, please tell me how you do that when 60% of the addresses in town are clustered around the center of town and the other 40% are on the side roads. Like, you can't, either you need to have some private money, or you need to have some flexibility in terms of the application of that rule. So the way that Vermont did it is they said, well, if you need to go, if there's only one way to get to the unserved, underserved addresses, we're going to let you pay to go from the start to get to those addresses. So essentially, we're not allowed to build any routes that have everyone being served, but we're able to build down a main road to get to the side roads, and they let us do that. BEAD doesn't let us do that, but the Vermont's ARPA does let us do that. But this is what I was focused on here is the funding and financing. That the whole challenge, if you will, is trying to make sure that you build the entire district and get to universal service as effectively and cost effectively as you can. So what does that mean? It means that you want to be building the areas that are the best combination of low cost and high take rate, right? So density plays into that, but also how unserved someone is plays into that, right? Because if I have 20 households per mile, but there's Comcast is already there, my take rate may not be the same as what it is if I have 10 houses or 8 houses per mile, but they have this, this DSL at 4.1, right? So, you sort of have to figure those things. And also just being clever with how you spend your grant money to set yourself up to be more efficient with the rest of your grant money, and then also strategically use non-grant funds. So for example, once you start having service, then you have some revenue that you can use, and depending on what your aerial costs are, let's just take a thumb suck of about, say, like $30,000 to $40,000 a mile for aerial, presuming that your design and some of your overheads are paid for, or already paid for because you've done your design. So it's once you have some subscribers, then you can build a mile or two of aerial because you now have service revenues, right? I mean, $30,000 to $50,000 isn't a huge amount of money once you get going and have subscribers, and so you can use some of those service revenues or other money that you're able to get through whatever means. And one of the means that we have in our toolkit in my CUD is that towns also got ARPA allocations. And so we got some donations of ARPA funds from our towns, and we got those with no strings attached. So we can do whatever we want with those. So we're actually using those ARPA funds to build areas that are dense, that are not eligible for other grant funding, so that we can, again, build service revenues, build a stronger revenue base. So these are all the different things that go into your challenge, should you choose to accept it, is to figure out how to get universal service to everyone. It doesn't need to be your fiber or your broadband everywhere. It can be if you think it's going to help your business case, but you can't pay for all of that with grant funds. But the question is, how do you make sure that you get service to everyone who needs it while maximizing the ratio of grants funds that you're able to get, and minimizing the interest rates that you pay, right? And I mean, you guys were talking, and maybe we should, because I could talk about this forever and ever, but I've got 15 minutes for my executive committee. But I think probably David's question is really the critical one, which is, how do you, whether it's your politicians or whatnot, but how do you get to a minimum critical size? Because I think if I had to give a simple answer to your question based on Vermont's experience, what you want to do is get a success story, get a case study in your state, because of course you can look at us and maybe others, but it helps to have one in your state. And then also you have to sell the problem. And I would have to think that you have rural areas that are also underserved. I apologize. I didn't take a ton of time to see like what your coverage map looks like, but I imagine that that the denser areas in and around Boston and the Cape and whatnot are probably pretty well served. But you get out to Western Mass and not so much. So clearly identifying the problem and having a case study. And then the other thing that I will say about CDs is I mentioned earlier that they grew organically by towns getting together. And so they sort of grew up rather than any sort of top-down planning. And perhaps unsurprisingly, they tended to grow up around the regional planning commissions, which are generally kind of mapped to the counties, not exactly. But when you look at the map of CUDs, it looks very similar to the map of regional planning commissions. And nothing wrong with that, except for the fact that some CUDs wound up being of such a composition that it was really tough for them to put together a viable business. And so it's the composition of the CUD combined with the universal service commitment created some challenges that ideally wouldn't be there. So I guess what I'm trying to say is if I was doing it again, if I was Vermont going back in time, I'd say, okay, like, great concept, but let's do a little bit of top-down design here to make sure that we don't wind up with any that are so small that they have the diseconomies of scale, or are maybe a decent size, but 70% of them already has strong competition, which again makes it tough for them to be able to turn a successful business.
So you're suggesting, Ellie, though, well, let's just say Massachusetts is at a point where, like you say, if you could go back in time, well, we're starting from scratch here in Massachusetts. If we were to go down this route, trying to learn from your example, if we have, like I said, we're fortunate to have Mark Lanigan from Senator Markey's office with us, and he's offered to try to help us, reach out to a group of legislators in Massachusetts and representatives to ask for their support in certain areas. And this may be one that makes sense. He may want to speak a little bit on this, but from starting from if we were to start at the legislature, as opposed to a grassroots effort from local communities coming up, if we were to look at it a different way and say, okay, we would be advocating for to start with a plan, from the state down, to try and make this available, to at least make put the laws in place to make it available for then communities to get together and understand what they're up against, and not to fight the uphill battle. Would you say that that's not that would be a good way for us to go about it, is to try and start with, big picture?
Yeah, I think that makes sense to start with big picture. Make sure that you have good enabling laws and regulations. You mentioned Make Ready earlier, so have a look at the Make Ready and the Make Ready regulations, because those things can really hamstring you if they're not done well, and it can take time because it took a bit of time, and EC Fiber again was the trailblazers in saying, this pole attachment rule we have is not really fair and equitable. And I think the single biggest thing was that there were no timeframes whatsoever. And that's a particular problem if the pole owning utility happens to be your competitor, and you put in a Make Ready request and then they sit on it for 2 years and you have no way to compel them to do anything, right? I mean, that could stop you in your tracks. So I don't know what your Make Ready situation is like. But
Yeah.
I would have a look at that. And the other thing I would say, by the way, is I think that so Vermont gave some money for planning grants and feasibility studies. And yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with those. I think that they're useful, but I mean, again, the situation changes so much that I think that probably more money was spent trying to get more accuracy in feasibility studies and early business plans than was really necessary. It's like I think that's one thing is, perfection is the enemy of the good, that, you can kind of look and say, okay, well, this is going to be of a sufficient size, and this is, like, you don't, that's that. And I would rather have spent the money that went on consultants doing feasibility studies to training the governing board or the early staff to make sure they know what they're doing. Because one of the things, I don't want to cast any shade on my fellow CEDs, because everyone has a different challenge. But what I have seen is that some of them have been blessed just almost by luck of either the staff that they hired or people on their governing boards. And we're one of the blessed CUDs in that our chair came from an inside plant background and has done a lot of things around the construction of our electronics hubs that was outside of my skill set. And we had someone, she's actually stepping down now, but she's very active in the early years, who did financing deals on Wall Street for telecom. And so that was, and then that combined with my background, which I didn't really go into, but it was like a lot of broadband strategy and business modeling. That was a really super combination. Some other CUDs haven't had those skills, and so as a result, they've either been a little bit further behind, or some of the things I've been talking here about. How do you optimize to make sure that you're as cost effective as possible? That's hard if you haven't done it before and you don't know what questions to ask. I mean, even for example, things like, I was looking at how much money, because before I came on as staff, I was on the executive committee, but I wasn't really in the weeds because I had other work. And then I came on as I mean, even when I knew I was coming on staff, I started looking at some of the costs we're spending on engineering or like this, that, and the other thing, and saying, that's, you know, like this is a big bill. Are we actually doing this the most efficiently, the most efficiently? So I think what I'm trying to say is that the big picture is important. But again, if I was doing it again, I would really want to spend some money because there's people like, I'm not trying to sell my own consulting services here, although it might sound like it, but there's tons of people like me who could very easily do a training to make sure that people who are going to be involved in leadership they weren't hamstrung because they didn't know what they didn't know. So we could do some skills transfer and some teaching to make sure that when people are now in a position of having to make these big decisions, that they, if they haven't come from industry before, or they've come from some other industry, like people came in from the electric utility side, but they didn't know broadband, or they came from wireless broadband, but they didn't know fiber broadband. So I think that's the other thing that I would do, is just making sure to invest in the human resources. Because I think for a long time there was a narrative of like, oh, you know, like, well, it like grassroots, they'll figure it out, and we have, but that doesn't mean that we've been the most efficient or cost efficient with our spending, just because, yeah, not everyone had the same skill set to begin with.
Well, I don't want to put you on the spot, Mark, but I'm wondering, you know, you and I talked a little bit about trying to, you know, make this a focus for this month's meeting for the coalition. And I'm wondering if you feel like, you know, there's anything missing here from information wise, or we need, if we were going to try and talk more to, you know, the state delegation, that we would, you know, need someone to do a similar kind of presentation for them. Like, if you're not ready to answer that, you want to think about it, we can regroup later. I guess I'm just wanted to give you an opportunity while Ellie's still here, because I think she only has 5 more minutes, right? Right.
Yep. For today.
Yeah.
But it's not like it's the only time I'm ever going to talk to you guys.
Okay. All right. And Bob has his hand up. Bob Egan, go ahead.
First of all, thank you. Great information. You're clearly an expert. When you looked at your top-down business plan, I guess in your district, and maybe have visibility into some of the others, and you talked a little bit about you know, the cost of passing, you know, in the cities versus the rural area. Can you tell me more about that? That's sort of my first question. Is it 2,000 a passing, or 3,000, or 700? And the second thing is, with the wireless operators starting to move out into, you know, some of these other areas, did they approach your district or any of the others to
Looks like we lost.
lease wholesale capacity?
Okay, let me start with the second question. The second question answer is no, not yet, and partly because if they already have their towers, they're already getting their capacity from somewhere, and also we're new and have also been focused on last mile distribution. But that was actually one of the first things that I looked at when I looked at CUD business models with my background. Is I said all these revenue assumptions, 100% of them are from home subscribers or small businesses. There's no enterprise, there's no wholesale. That's a big opportunity. But the other thing as well is that these folks don't want to sign deals with 10 different CUDs. They probably want to sign one deal. So we have had some talks of forming a special purpose vehicle so that we could facilitate statewide or larger sort of enterprise deals. So that one's going. And I'm just having a look here. Like a good sorry. I'd have to get back to you on the cost per mile, because I don't seem to have it handy here in my model, but I could do that.
Okay.
And Bob, if I can just quickly jump in to put a
Sure.
point on the conversation about engaging at the state level. As far as I know, there is legislation in front of the Massachusetts legislature to enable this sort of like regional approach. Our office, because we're at the federal level, we don't get directly involved in state legislation, but because we are supportive of, you know, the broadband rollout that Bob we've talked about, and I talked about with folks in Bourne and on the Cape and, you know, all across the Commonwealth, we can get indirectly involved. And so part of that, I think, is sort of facilitating a conversation that Bob, you and I have talked about, where I'm speaking with our state legislators. I would encourage you also to speak to them. And I do think a sort of information session for stakeholders at the Telecommunications Utility and Energy Committee at the state level, as I believe who currently has the state bill. I don't know if this is on their radar or not. I know they have the bill in front of their committee, but I don't know, how much attention they're paying to it. But definitely any, advocacy that you all can do to your state leaders, and that we can also help facilitate at the federal level with the state leaders, I'd be more than happy to. And information like this, Ellie, is incredible, I think, for me in particular, in learning what's possible, so that when federal dollars end up coming down, they get used in the right places for the right models. But also just in terms of when I talk to our state delegation, that would be wonderful to tell them.
So, Mark, when you mentioned a bill already in place, you're talking about the state, the Make Ready one, or you're talking about something specific to, like CUDs or regional efforts? Which one of those were you referring to?
Well, I know there's the Make Ready bill. I think there's also a CUDs type proposal.
Oh.
I think it looks a little bit different than the Vermont one, but I haven't looked that closely into it.
Oh, okay. That would be helpful if you were able to share with us what that, what the name of the number of the bill is, and, so we could circulate that so people could get familiar with it. That'd be great.
Yeah, I can find that.
Yeah.
All right.
And the other quick thing I wanted to say is, I mentioned earlier the BEAD program. I'm not sure where Massachusetts is with its BEAD program rules, but the intent of the NTIA's BEAD program is to get universal fiber everywhere. And so I don't want to say it's too late for something like this. It's never too late, but I think just you should keep that in mind. Have a look at what the Volume 2 program rules look like, because what you probably want to do is if possible, try and align with that program and figure out how you might create these public entities that are well positioned to partner with private companies that are already planning to bid on BEAD, and maybe like some of the smaller companies could bid in partnership with the public entities that again would be tax exempt and provide a good competition to the bigger national players that are kind of the default winners for these things unless other things come into place.
Yeah, one of the things that I wondered is, and you may be running out of time to answer, but when you were first starting the smaller communities, how did you fund things, like even legal expenses, procurement services, things like that you needed to be able to do to get your business plan in place? How were those funded by the individual communities?
Well, I'm not sure about EC Fiber, but the other CDs, and after this I do have to go. The other CDs there was a little bit that seed funding that I mentioned that came in 2019. That was essentially a planning grant.
Okay.
So it gave some money for that. And I will share the slides in the documentary, and I'm going to share another slide deck that I didn't even present today that you guys can have a look through. So I'll send those all to you, Bob. And
yes.
Thank you guys for the time. I've appreciated it, and I'm here as a resource to continue helping you along this path.
Well, thank you very much.
And do you have a business plan that you could share?
Not really. The last time we did the business plan, it needs to be significantly revised. So I could share a very old one, but it's out of date.
Well, if you could qualify it that way, it might still be helpful to us. Okay. Well, yes, again, thank you on behalf of the group here. We really appreciate your time with us, Ellie, and we'll probably be in touch with you in the future.
My pleasure. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon.
Best of luck to you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right. Bye. Okay. So that's that. And I just realized, Mark, I think the last time you and I talked that I was supposed to send you or introduce you to Heidi Mahoney, who's the woman from let's see, Go NetSpeed, and they're the ones that were primarily behind the Make Ready legislation. They initially advocating for that, and she has a wealth of information. So I'm going to forward you her contact information very shortly here, so that you'll have that, and ask if she wouldn't mind spending some time with you to kind of explain a little bit if there's anything in there that you need further clarification on. But so I didn't have.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. I didn't have much else on the agenda for today. It's kind of, I figured this was a pretty big topic for us to think about, but it's certainly, we can open up the rest of the time that we do have, however long everyone would like to go this afternoon. I probably do have to cut out at about 4 o'clock. But we can open up the conversation to anything else people want to talk about right now, or if you want to continue discussion about the CUDs. Any?
Just a quick question, and maybe the guys in Falmouth can expound on it, but has anybody on South Coast or the other towns, have they been approached by a company called Boundless, who coincidentally is running the fiber system in St. Johnsbury, Vermont? And I know they put an offer in front of the town of Falmouth, and yesterday or the day before there was a presentation by them to the Cape Cod Technology Council, where they said they were going to serve, if everything fell in place, all of Cape Cod, all 15 towns, and have everything installed in 3 years. And they were going to offer an entry price of 1 gig up, 1 gig down for $55 a month with no cost to the towns.
Wow, that's fantastic.
I know a lot about that company. I'm happy to talk about it if you want.
But again, I was just wondering if anybody else off Cape has been approached by them at all.
Off Cape or on Cape?
Well, I know about who they've started to approach on Cape, and other than Falmouth and Bourne, I won't name names right now, but they are making the rounds in Barnstable County. And I was just wondering if they have gone beyond the Cape Cod right now. Bob, I defer to you. You guys in Falmouth know much more about this than I do.
Yeah, I mean, were you there yesterday at the Cape Cod Technology
Yes.
Presentation? Yeah. So what I heard is that they, in their slideware, they promised to do the whole Cape. But during the Q&A, they backed off. And actually, a lot of their presentations through their parent company and elsewhere, they've always maintained, in the slideware anyhow, commercially affordable addresses, right? And so they've built some different business models in different towns with different financial thresholds. And I won't say what those are, but somebody emails me or call me, I'm happy to walk you through. Second, during Q&A, their legal counsel stepped in and sort of corrected, some of the comments by their CEO, and that is that 100% coverage was a desire, not a plan. And so I'm hoping that in our own MLB, that in our select board, they take a serious look at what reality is, versus what some of the slideware is talked about. Third, I guess, is that so far as I know, it's 6 cities and towns, not 13 or 15. And they have approached a couple. B-Town, they've been pretty vocal about. I think you had another question about it, but I forgot. I mean, I know those guys pretty well.
Where are they going to get their money?
Well, we've asked them, and they were asked again yesterday during the Cape Cod Technology meeting. And I think there was 2 things that came out. One, they're still trying to raise money. It's private equity. They do want to build and own the network, and they haven't, what's the right word I want to use without having a lawyer call me up? They haven't offered any town equity positions, right? And so there's a lot of worry on the Cape about first right of refusal for non-performance or abandonment or, all kinds of things. And as you might imagine, on the Cape, wastewater, clean water, affordable housing, these are all big deal, probably in some of your towns too, right? And I think a lot of towns and cities are thinking, 20 years from now, fiber is going to reach, broadband is going to be those kind of critical proportions that we have in some of these traditional things. And so how do we protect ourselves? How do we ensure that we're doing the right thing as we either allow these investments to come in or we do public, private joint ventures like they're doing up in Vermont and some of the open access models. So I think we're still a bit away.
Yeah, the real concern was, the rules are really going to be set by the golden rule. Them that has the gold makes the rules. So whatever their VC agreements are, or whomever their investors are, if their investors are okay, we want to get this thing up and built, and we'll sign up a whole bunch of customers, with the 20,000 passings or whatever in Falmouth and X, Y, and Bourne. Then at the end of 5 years or 7 years, when the VC folks want to get out, they say, okay, we'll sell to the highest bidder, and all of a sudden we have Comcast too.
Well, that's what I wrote last week. I said we do not want a Comcast too, and you'll see more publicity tomorrow. I mean, that's really a big worry. And Brian, I know you work with Brian. He has some great questions during the meeting.
Great. I wish he were on this call right now. Brian is sound asleep in Thailand right now, so
he's traveling to Thailand.
He's not traveling. He's working there. Okay.
Oh, he was on the video yesterday. I didn't know.
Oh yeah, that was but that was in the morning. Okay, so that's after midnight he goes to sleep.
Wait, last month he was headed to Poland. You talking about Brian McCreary there?
Brian McCarter, right? Well, he had stopped off there just for a couple of weeks visit with his college roommate, and then after that he went on to Thailand.
Oh,
oh, I didn't know that.
But anyway, but he's a very active participant in certainly in our committee, and again, he's got a big background in municipal bonding when he worked for John Hancock.
Yeah.
So he understands the financing of this stuff intimately, and he's picked up a good bit on the technology. So he's trying to opine or reverse engineer what the business plans might be for any of the investors here. And basically, he said they're going to be looking to get out in a few years. And it may be that there's another investor for Tilson who buys it and decides to keep running it, or maybe not. Now, my one question for you, Bob, is what are they asking for the town? If this is a private business coming in where they need a business license and some building permits and some other stuff, and say, hey, we're going to start selling, putting cable up and selling service, what do they need as a partnership from the town?
Well, I think that's one of the rubs. They don't think they need anything.
Yeah,
Boundless is pretty inexperienced and they haven't deployed anything yet. So Tilson is, and we actually paid them for a high level design back in 2019.
And we've seen that was a wonderful program. This is a pure opinion, but it might well be that they want some kind of a handshake agreement with the town, so they do a public-private partnership to go after Gap Network 2, to go after DEI grants, to go after the new public housing grant that was announced this morning, to go after BEAD, you name it.
You know what? I agree with you. So we'll see what happens.
Okay. Well, that's okay.
I agree with you.
Again, this is just data gathering. I'll report back to our committee and the select board and say we know nothing so far.
Brian's got my email. You can give it, and you and I can get together and talk some more if you want, or anybody else if you want.
Yeah, that's
try to be on the select board meeting tonight. I think this is on your on the select board agenda.
Okay.
I don't belong to this. The select board's not till
6 p.m.
No, that's the MLB is tonight.
Oh, MLB. I'm sorry.
Select board is on the 25th.
Yeah. Anyway.
I'm not on a select board. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's that model that you're describing there that Boundless is offering would be provide competition in the sense of one new provider for competition and only one. But the other model that we've seen is an open access model where someone would come in and build, or the town would build.
Yeah.
And I think that model, if communities could, find a way to build that, would be less prone to this, a few years down the road, 5 years down the road, it gets flipped back to Comcast, I think that would be, but, that's, I guess that remains to be seen, but I know that, when, someone approached our town about doing something like that, and the same question came up was, what do you need from the town? And they said essentially nothing. If you were to, look at the cable, license that the town has with Comcast right now, that's for, public education and government access funds, revenues coming back to the town as a percentage of the, their revenue. But that's just because we have a cable license. It's nothing to do with, so in other words, if they come in and they're strictly building out a network for, of fiber that's non-television based, then they don't even need any authorization from the community. They can just simply, go through the make ready process and build out the service. And I don't know if anybody else on this call right now has more knowledge about that, but that's what we were told. Is that anybody had that? So it's essentially, if they're not providing any kind of television service, they're just providing, internet service provider access to the internet, then they're not subject to the requirements of the negotiating a contract with the town for,
Well, the regulations from the FCC say that the town and like Falmouth Cable TV, things like that, you can negotiate those kinds of things, but the FCC does not, and actually in some ways prohibits you negotiating internet only access. It's really kind of awkward. I think there's some moves to make some changes, but that doesn't prevent cities and towns from forming a public, a municipal owned, public private,
oh, right,
or allow a public entity in and negotiate what's the deal look like. I mean, a warm handshake in a town is going to help with the make ready or permitting with Eversource. And I think there's some new companies that don't really understand that, it's better to have a warm handshake than a cold foot. So,
well, yeah, I mean, the point you made about access to grant funds is probably the biggest single thing right there that can really help. So,
well, and you also have to be thinking about, you've got residential passing, enterprise passing, business passing, middle mile, and then the long mile reach, right? And so I really love what Ellie had to say, that our network is, to the point she was making about passing, it's going to be a whole less complex than I see Chelsea and Westford and somebody and the Cape. I mean, so we've got some areas in some towns, they got long deserted roads and driveways, and other places were pretty congested. So we're seeing there's a lot of diversity in how you got to build these things at the Cape.
yeah. Okay.
Peter Chase had his hand up there. I don't know if he still is.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I just went through cable negotiations, and I know that we couldn't discuss anything but cable. So I would assume that is correct. That federal law prohibits you from negotiating anything other than cable in the right of ways. So
that's
cable
our
video, cable TV.
right. Cable TV.
That's our restriction in Bourne for that part of our committee.
Okay.
Bob, you asked a question earlier to Ellie, and she didn't have a number for you, but I can tell you, on average, to bring a service into a house is about $2,000. That's what we do for budgetary numbers.
Yeah.
Now we're gonna do a neighborhood that's 55 plus, where the builder put conduit in, and it's gonna cost us $500 a house, right? So like, if you can make deals with the builders while they're actually putting infrastructure in, it becomes a lot cheaper. You can pass some of the costs on to them. But that's like it. So 2,000 is the overhead. That includes, we run our fiber in the power space, so it's more expensive. So that brings it down, brings the service to the house, splicing, penetrate the house, put the piece of equipment in the house. So on average, we just kind of, for budgetary use, 2,000.
Yep.
But
we have some towns from 1,700 or so to about 2,300, depending on where you are on the Cape. That's,
Yeah, and I
that's
think
really good info.
I'm wondering, if in Tom's with an MLP and they have their own equipment and service crews and everything, right? So there's probably I don't know if that's helping your cost factor in that regard or not really.
It's the opposite.
The opposite. Okay.
Yep.
You're being very
I
honest.
mean, you laugh, but if we could run in the comm space, we'd save a lot more money.
Yeah.
By
Okay.
contractual agreements and stuff, we can't do that.
I see. All
Are you a
right.
union shop?
Yes.
Oh,
Okay. Yeah, that explains it. All right. Well, that's a good reference point. So
So
okay.
we,
How long have you had a municipal offering? Is it Taunton? Is that right?
Yeah, so we started the ISP back in 1997 and it was dial-up. And at the height of our existence, I think we had 4,000 dial-up customers. And then we went through some growing pains as we switched over to fiber optics. I'll tell you the little history if you guys want to hear it.
Sure.
The way we got into the industry was we wanted to run fiber to our SCADA system, right? Our distribution system. And one of the gentlemen on the team said, hey, while we're running, why don't we sell the remaining fiber to the industrial parks that we're going to pass? Because that's where our big equipment was for SCADA. So we went ahead and we did that. We were able to carve out some space. We have every big player in the industry for commercial. And we never focused on residential though, because it was way beyond. We're talking 2020, 2001. Like we never envisioned fiber to the home at that time. It wasn't until about 5 years later we started thinking about it.
Yeah.
So we probably would have laid down the roots a little bit differently. We were only running 48 count. We wish we were running 144 count. And stuff like that. We're at the point now that some of our fiber is aged out and we have to replace our 48 counts, which is been bad. So then what we did is we did a couple pilot programs for fiber to the home. We tried to do a triple play. We built a whole front end and everything, and that was a complete disaster. It's a lot of overhead for equipment and whatnot. And we realized we just wanted to be in the broadband sector. We didn't really want to have to deal with video, phone, and we learned over the time. And now with watching technology, everyone's streaming and everything's IP phone anyway. So that's kind of where we are right now.
Did you bring in a private ISP, or how did you do the front end?
We buy from Ocean in Rhode Island, and we actually have a connection through Bridgewater State University all the way up to Boston. So we actually buy from tier 1, tier 2 internet providers and resell.
Okay, got it.
Interesting. Now, when you said that some of your fiber has aged out, do you mean in terms of like bandwidth capacity? Are you talking about it physically as wear and tear? Because I was under the impression that fiber lasts like, much longer than 20, 25 years.
It's everything. So we've seen fiber fail, just the casing, not so much the fiber itself, the casings, the splicing points and whatnot. We've saturated our 48 count so that, we're maybe have one fiber left in a 48 count that we're kind of reserved for an emergency. We've also realized that like the local municipals and fire and whatever, they're some of our biggest customers. Our biggest customers are probably the school systems, police and fire, and then the local municipals. And they're the ones that actually get all the grant money. So we help design their solutions, and they go get the grant money, and then they actually pay us to actually implement and then provide internet service.
Okay. All right. Anybody else have anything you want to, add or questions before, we wrap up, and we could talk about, ideas for the next meeting too. And again, I want to reiterate, I know we've lost some people already off this call, and there's a different mix of people on every call, but so I will send an email out to people, but, I am going to be, as of April 1st, no longer a member of the select board in Fairhaven. So this email account that I've been reaching out to everyone will no longer be valid after that point. I am going to ask if the town would like to keep me on as a, you know, I was appointed by the town to kind of belong to this group, so to speak, and bring back information to our select board. So I'm going to offer to do that, continue to do that, but I will not be able to retain the town's, email address because there's a cost associated with that, and we're in a budget deficit situation, so I'm not going to propose it. But
Bob, I've got one other question before we close, and this is for Brian Espinola in New Bedford. I understand that New Bedford applied for the first round of GAP network grants. Have you heard a decision back from MBI yet?
No, we haven't heard anything yet. Still waiting to hear.
Okay, just out of curiosity, we got arm twisted by both Verizon and Comcast to write letters of support for their applications on the condition that they would come through and serve the underserved and unserved areas in Bourne, and haven't heard squat yet. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
Can I ask one other question of the group here? What is the latest on the Make Ready legislation? Is there anything coming that's going to make all this easier or not?
I reached out to Heidi, some time ago, and there was a time where this group was thinking about, advocating as a group of, for that and, sending out letters. And then we decided collectively that it really wasn't the best thing for us to do. Because we don't have a formal structure with, voting and, it's kind of a loose group that comes together every month. It's just different people that show up. There's kind of a core group that seems to be here every month, but that fluctuates who's here. And so we just decided, well, each community can do their own thing and advocate on their own. But I did reach out to her a few months ago, and she said it was still in progress. I haven't heard anything otherwise since, but I have, I was going to forward her information over to Mark right after this meeting, and hoping that, he can get an update from her, and maybe she'll, what I'll ask is for her to reply, to my email with an update if she knows anything. She would know if there's been any updates in the last couple months, and I can be happy to forward that to
Yeah,
to
that'd be great. I'd appreciate that very much.
Yeah, you're on our listserv, right? Our
Yeah.
email list, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think recently. Yep.
Yes. Okay, great. So we'll do that. So does anybody have any suggestions for a guest speaker for next month, or a topic for next month that you think we would, we should get into?
Bob, if I can just really quickly on the Make Ready legislation too, because I talked about, the Senator Markey's position on the regional model, CUD model legislation, which is that we don't directly get involved, but we indirectly get involved. And it's the same thing with the Make Ready legislation. And Bob Egan, I heard you laughing earlier when we were talking about Massachusetts procurement laws. They are difficult. So again, something that we understand very much the difficulties of. And it's just because it's state legislation, we don't get directly involved, but indirectly, we're advocating to make it easier. So.
Okay, great.
So
Yeah,
who's
that's
the
helpful. I think to me that the big thing that would help, Mark, is just kind of getting the attention of, Senator Markey's office will get the ear of, the people that we want to hear our story much easier than if I was to reach out to them or any of our individuals. So I think that would be really helpful if you can kind of, maybe organize something where we could present all of our concerns to them, or, maybe, have kind of a broadband, meet and greet or luncheon or something like that, where we have an opportunity to maybe even meet some of them in person, or do a Zoom thing, whatever. That's just a couple thoughts, but
Yeah, let me see what I can do, because I'd love to put something like that together.
Yeah, great.
Could I suggest, I think it would be, do we have somebody at the state level who, on the staff, or some of the Congress, senators or representatives who are really focused on this broadband issue? And is there some way we can be in touch with them and kind of communicate, and maybe have somebody from their office sitting in on our meetings? so that we'd have a link to the state?
Yeah, I
I-
don't know exactly who at the state level. Maybe Carl, maybe you know.
Well, I think
No,
we-
but what I was going to suggest is whoever the sponsor of the Make Ready bill is, that we should consider reaching out and
Yeah.
asking them to be a guest speaker.
That
at
sounds
a-
great.
Well, that was Heidi Mahoney from Go NetSpeed. She did join us, in one of our earlier meetings, maybe I would say earlier, but maybe 4 months ago or something like that. And so we could, bring her back if she's willing to come to our next meeting. We could ask her to come back in.
But
That's.
she wasn't the state rep or
Oh, you're talking about state reps. I'm sorry.
or
Yes,
senator. Yeah,
Yes, there were some names on the
on the bill.
she had given to us, right? That's a good point. And so maybe we could ask her for a recommendation on who that person would be. And that's a good idea, Carl. I like that one. So again, I will forward that off to you. What I'll do is introduce you, Mark, and to her, just say that we're collectively, we're trying to learn a little bit more about this. And that we'd like to see if there's a way that we can help kind of move this along in any way. And that you're going to try and help us get the right people at the state level to get their ear in, and maybe speak to them collectively. So, all right, that's a good one. All right.
And Bob, are you going to disseminate the slides from Ellie?
Yes, I certainly will.
She was
what
really
I think
great.
She mentioned that she would have three things, the slide presentation she had today, a second one that I'm not sure, it's probably a little more in depth, and then also a link to that documentary. So I'll send all three of them when I get them. Yes, for sure.
Bob, as soon as I see it online, there may be a video online of the presentation by Boundless. If anybody wants to, it's a Cape Cod Technology Council, and it's the second item. It's about an hour in on the agenda. The first one is microgrid out in electrical microgrid out in Provincetown.
Oh,
But if I have that, I'll send it to you and you can disseminate it.
excellent. Thank you. Appreciate it. All right. Well, unless there's anything further here, we'll just close this one out for today, and appreciate everyone coming on board for this. I think it was a productive meeting again, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob.
All right, you're
Thanks.
welcome. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.